Next up is Karl Marx, which I'm sure you've at least probably heard of in your life. He lived 1818 to 1883. He was German, born in Trier, Prussia, which is now part of Germany. His father was a wealthy lawyer, which is kind of an important aspect, and modern Marxist theorists like to point to this a lot and sort of imagine how his worldview was shaped growing up in a wealthy family. Even though he himself wasn't wealthy in his adult life, he was raised in a wealthy family. And so his sort of ideas about capitalism and the economy and things like that were shaped at a young age by being wealthy, and then older later on, not so much. He incredibly intelligent. Begins college at the age of 17. He really wanted to study philosophy, but his father insisted that he study law, sort of a more practical profession. That didn't stop him, though, from studying a multitude of disciplines when he went to college. He studied philosophy and English, Italian, literature, art history, economics, poetry, on and on and on. He earns his PhD in 1831 at the age of 24. Interestingly, he does most of his work at the University of Berlin, but they had sort of a conservative faculty. Really, their faculty was made up of conservatives, more conservatives at the time, and they wouldn't grant him his PhD based on the thesis that he had written. They viewed it as too radical. He eventually transfers to the University of Bonn, if I remember correctly, and they have slightly more liberal faculty, and they end up granting his PhD. He considers a career in academics probably for not more than a fleeting 5 seconds, because his thoughts are so radical that the government doesn't really ever say, hey, you can't become an academic, but they sort of make it difficult for him to do so because of his views, and his research are so liberal. So he actually, most people don't know this, but he supports himself throughout his life really as a journalist most of the time. His first real job after college, he was a journalist for a radical newspaper in Cologne, Germany, where he wrote articles about economics and socialism. He also wrote articles that were highly critical of the local government and various social leaders, and the newspaper ends up getting banned by the Prussian government 1 year after Marx begins writing there. Him and his wife then move to Paris, where he again begins writing for a radical newspaper, which also gets shut down right after Marx begins writing there. Why anyone kept hiring him to write for their newspapers is a mystery, because it basically meant sure death for your publication very shortly. Right after that, he begins writing for an uncensored newspaper, a radical newspaper called Vorwärts in Paris. That lasts for a while, though it gets shut down by the request of the Prussian king about 2 years after Marx begins writing there, and Marx gets expelled from France for his contributions to this newspaper. Really important event that happens around this time in his life. He goes to, he travels to take part, meet with this revolutionary group that's forming. And while he's traveling, he meets a gentleman by the name of Friedrich Engels. We really can't have a conversation about Marx without mentioning Engels for now. They form a lifelong friendship, and they write extensively together. In fact, some of the most prominent writings that Marx does, Engels is actually a co-author, and that's kind of a little-known fact. Engels actually co-authored the Manifesto of the Communist Party, but most people don't know that. Most people have never even heard of Engels. Incredibly influential sort of philosopher in his own right, but he's an industrialist. He comes from a wealthy family, and he takes over the family's business. So he's incredibly wealthy, but not really afraid to put his name out there and write some of those radical things with Marx. Their relationship is important because Marx suffers financially his whole life, as you are learning from newspaper to newspaper, on and on. And Engels actually supports him financially, him and his family, at different periods in his life. Mainly, and Engels says, it's because he believes that Marx's mind is so valuable to humanity that he's willing to basically sponsor his time so that he can write and really contribute to intellectual thought. So after he gets expelled from France, he moves to Belgium in 1845, and basically the government sort of unofficially says, you can come to Belgium as long as you agree not to write anything political. You can stay in the country as long as you don't write anything critiquing the government, and he sort of agrees at this point in his life. Engels and Marx around this time travel to England to meet with some leaders of a socialist movement, and it's there that Marx starts working on this book called The German Ideology. That's so influential that we're going to do that on its own. So we'll save a specific individual separate thing talking about the German ideology. Incredibly famous. And in fact, I would argue that that's more influential than the manifesto, but we'll talk about that later. The interesting thing is he's not known for the German ideology during his lifetime because it was censored and it wasn't published until 1932, so 50 years after Marx dies. So it's kind of interesting. Obviously, he's probably most well known for the Manifesto of the Communist Party. This gets published in 1848. We're not going to talk about that extensively. We will later on. We'll have a whole unit on communism, and we'll talk about the history of the manifesto, and we'll read it and talk about some quotes from that and stuff like that. But just know for now that that was written in 1848. After a revolution in France in 1848, Belgian workers are planning a revolution. Remember, Marx is still in Belgium at this time. And Marx was assumed by local authorities to have provided financial support to the movement. Although he probably didn't, because he basically had no money his whole life for most of it anyways. So that probably wasn't true, but they accuse him of doing it anyways, and he's forced to leave Belgium and returns to France. He only stays in France for a short while before moving to Cologne, where he thinks a revolution might take place, and he really wants to be involved in it, but it never really ends up coming to fruition. While he's in Cologne, though, he starts a newspaper of his own. So his father dies and leaves him a little bit of inheritance. This is probably the only time in Marx's life where he has a slight amount of money, and he uses that money to start his own newspaper. So every newspaper he's worked at thus far has got shut down because of his involvement. So he says, hey, I'm just going to start my own, which he does. Marx and other newspaper staff are constantly harassed by local authorities, and Marx himself gets charged with many crimes, such as, quote, insulting the chief public prosecutor, unquote, which I always think is a funny crime, because of course he's writing all kinds of radical articles about the local authorities, though he never gets found guilty of any of these crimes. The government in Prussia collapses at this time, and the king orders Marx to leave the country. In 1848, he returns to Paris, and he's shortly asked to leave Paris, so he finally relocates to London, where he will end up spending the rest of his life. So basically, the story of Marx's life is writing for a newspaper gets shut down, local government asks him to leave, moves to another country, and rinse and repeat over and over and over again until he finally ends up in London, and he lives there for the rest of his life. Kind of interesting that he can't get work at any European newspapers. So at this point in his life, while he's living in London, he starts writing for U.S. newspapers, most notably the New York Tribune, which was then the most widely read newspaper in the U.S. He basically is kind of like a British correspondent. He writes articles about British affairs. So if an election would happen in Britain, Marx would have written an article for the New York Tribune. When the Civil War breaks out in the U.S., he writes about this. Kind of interestingly and controversially, he writes some articles about his opinion on the Civil War. I might mention that a little bit later once we have some context to sort of frame his opinion. He writes at the Tribune, and he actually loves it until the editors change, and sort of the voice of the paper changes a little bit as they get a more conservative editor, and Marx ends up quitting. Fun fact, the editor of the New York Tribune, when Marx was writing there, was a man by the name of Horace Greeley, and they became friends and liked each other quite a bit. When Horace Greeley leaves, Marx leaves. Horace Greeley is the person who basically founded the city of Greeley, Colorado, and that's who it's named after. So kind of a fun bit of trivia there. Another one of Marx's works that he's incredibly famous for is Capital, or most people now refer to it just as Capital. He publishes, it's 3 volumes. He publishes volume 1 in 1867. It's basically like Marx's magnum opus. It's his life's work. It's a ton of reading, but it's his theories from everything from social life to social theory to ideology to economics, power, how history evolves. It's almost all of Marx's ideas in this work. So he publishes volume 1 in 1867. The other 2 volumes get published after his death. Engels gathers up all of his manuscripts, and Engels himself publishes the final 2 volumes. So kept this a little short because we're going to expand upon and have specific ones focused on the German ideology and specific ones focused on the manifesto later on in the semester when we talk about communism. Takeaway from this is that Karl Marx actually just gets a really bad rap from history. For mostly everyone, when you hear Karl Marx's name, you immediately think of communism, but he actually was more influential, I'm going to argue, in philosophy and history than he actually was with the manifesto. He contributed so many things in so many fields to sort of advance thought in different disciplines. The manifesto is kind of like, even though it became influential, at the time I think it was just sort of like a throwaway work for Marx, where he said, oh, this will be interesting, I'll write this little book for the people to read. But he contributed so much more than just the manifesto that he's got a really bad rap from history. His legacy should be much, much more and more widely respected than just the manifesto. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on.